This is a continuation of Now It Can Be Told by Philip Gibbs, comprising Part 6, Chapters 20 through 23.
Part 6, Chapter 20. I have described what happened on our side of the lines, our fearful losses, the stream of wounded that came back day by day, the butchers' shops, the agony in men's souls, the shell shock cases, the welter and bewilderment of battle, the shelling of our own troops, the lack of communication between fighting units and the command, the filth and stench of the hideous shambles which were our battlefields. But to complete the picture of that human conflict in the sum, I must now tell what happened on the German side of the lines, as I was able to piece the tale together from German prisoners with whom I talked, German letters which I found in their abandoned dugouts, and documents which fell into the hands of our staff officers. Our men were at least inspirited by the knowledge that they were beating their enemy back, in spite of their own bloody losses. The Germans had not even that source of comfort, for whatever it might be worth under barrage fire. The mistakes of our generalship, the inefficiency of our staff work, were not greater than the blunderings of the German High Command, and their problem was more difficult than ours because of the weakness of their reserves, owing to enormous preoccupation on the Russian front. The agony of their men was greater than ours. To understand the German situation, it must be remembered that from January to May 1916, the German command on the Western Front was concentrating all its energy and available strength in manpower and gunpowder upon the attack of Verdun. The Crown Prince had staked his reputation upon that adventure, which he believed would end in the capture of the strongest French fortress and the destruction of the French armies. He demanded men and more men, until every unit that could be spared from other fronts of the line had been thrown into that furnace. Divisions were called in from other theatres of war, and increased the strength on the Western Front to a total of about 130 divisions. But the months passed and Verdun still held out above piles of German corpses on its slopes, and in June Germany looked east and saw a great menace. The Russian offensive was becoming violent. German generals on the Russian front sent desperate messages for help. "Send us more men," they said, and from the Western Front 4 divisions containing 39 battalions were sent to them. They must have been sent grudgingly, for now another menace threatened the enemy, and it was ours. The British armies were getting ready to strike. In spite of Verdun, France still had men enough withdrawn from that part of the line in which they had been relieved by the British to co-operate in a new attack. It was our offensive that the German command feared most, for they had no exact knowledge of our strength or of the quality of our new troops. They knew that our army had grown prodigiously since the assault on Loos, nearly a year before. They had heard of the Canadian reinforcements and the coming of the Australians, and the steady increase of recruiting in England, and month by month they had heard the louder roar of our guns along the line, and had seen their destructive effect spreading and becoming more terrible. They knew of the steady, quiet concentration of batteries and divisions on the west and south of the Ancre. The German command expected a heavy blow, and prepared for it, but as yet had no knowledge of the driving force behind it. What confidence they had of being able to resist the British attack was based upon the wonderful strength of the lines which they had been digging and fortifying since the autumn of the first year of war. Impregnable positions. They had called them the inexperience of our troops, their own immense quantity of machine guns, the courage and skill of their gunners, and their profound belief in the superiority of German generalship. In order to prevent espionage during the coming struggle, and to conceal the movement of troops and guns, they ordered the civil populations to be removed from villages close behind their positions, drew cordons of military police across the country, picketed crossroads, and established a network of counter-espionage to prevent any leakage of information. To inspire the German troops with a spirit of martial fervor, not easily aroused to fever pitch after the bloody losses before Verdun, orders of the day were issued to the battalions counseling them to hold fast against the hated English, who stood foremost in the way of peace. That was the gist of a manifesto by Prince Ruprecht of Bavaria, which I found in a dugout at Montauban, and promising them a speedy ending to the war. Great stores of material and munitions were concentrated at railheads, and dumps ready to be sent up to the firing lines, and the perfection of German organization may well have seemed flawless before the attack began. When they began, they found that in heavies and in expenditure of high explosives they were outclassed. They were startled, too, by the skill and accuracy of the British gunners, whom they had scorned as amateurs, and by the daring of our airmen, who flew over their lines with the utmost audacity, spotting for the guns and registering on batteries, communication trenches, crossroads, railheads, and every vital point of organization in the German war machine working opposite the British lines north and south of the Ancre. Even before the British infantry had left their trenches at dawn on July 1st, German officers behind the firing line saw with anxiety that all the organization which had worked so smoothly in times of ordinary trench warfare was now working only in a hazardous way under a deadly storm of shells. Food and supplies of all kinds could not be sent up to front-line trenches without many casualties, and sometimes could not be sent up at all. Telephone wires were cut and communications broken between the front and headquarters staffs. Staff officers sent up to report were killed on the way to the lines. Troops moving forward from reserve areas came under heavy fire and lost many men before arriving in the support trenches. Prince Ruprecht of Bavaria, sitting aloof from all this in personal safety, must have known before July 1st that his resources in men and material would be strained to the uttermost by the British attack, but he could take a broader view than men closer to the scene of battle, and taking into account the courage of his troops, he had no need to doubt that the immense strength of their positions, dug and tunneled beyond the power of high explosives, the number of his machine guns, the concentration of his artillery, and the rawness of the British troops, he could count up the possible cost and believe that in spite of a heavy price to pay there would be no break in his lines. At 7:30 a.m. on July 1st, the British infantry, as I have told, left their trenches and attacked on the right angle down from Gommecourt, Beaumont, Hamel, Thiepval, Overlars, and Le Boissel, and eastward from Fricourt, below Mametz and Montauban. For a week the German troops, Bavarians and Prussians, had been crouching in their dugouts, listening to the ceaseless crashing of the British drum fire. In places like Beaumont Hamel, the men down in the deep tunnels, some of them large enough to hold a battalion, and a half was safe as long as they stayed there. But to get in or out was death. Trenches disappeared into a sea of shell craters, and the men holding them, for some men had to stay on duty, they were blown to fragments. Many of the shallower dugouts were smashed in by heavy shells, and officers and men lay dead there, as I saw them lying on the first days of July, in Fricourt and Mametz and Montauban. The living men kept their courage, but below ground, under that tumult of bursting shells, and wrote pitiful letters to their people at home, describing the horror of those hours. "We are quite shut off from the rest of the world," wrote one of them. "Nothing comes to us. No letters. The English keep such a barrage on our approaches, it is terrible. Tomorrow evening it will be 7 days since this bombardment began. We cannot hold out much longer. Everything is shot to pieces." Thirst was one of their tortures. In many of the tunneled shelters there was food enough, but the water could not be sent up. The German soldiers were maddened by thirst. When rain fell, many of them crawled out and drank filthy water mixed with yellow shell sulfur, and then were killed by high explosives. Other men crept out, careless of death, but compelled to drink. They crouched over the bodies of the men who lay above or in the shell holes and lapped up the puddles, and then crawled down again if they were not hit. When our infantry attacked at Gommecourt and Beaumont Hamel and Thiepval, they were received by waves of machine gun bullets fired by men who, in spite of the ordeal of our 7 days' bombardment, came out into the open now, at the moment of attack which they knew through their periscopes was coming. They brought their guns above the shell craters of their destroyed trenches under our barrage and served them. They ran forward even into no man's land and planted their machine guns there and swept down our men as they charged. Over their heads the German gunners flung a frightful barrage, ploughing gaps in the ranks of our men. On the left, by Gommecourt and Beaumont Hamel, the British attack failed, as I have told, but southward the impregnable lines were smashed by a tide of British soldiers as sand castles are overwhelmed by the waves. Our men swept up to Fricourt, struck straight up to Montauban on the right, captured it, and flung a loop round Mametz village. For the German generals, receiving their reports with great difficulty, because runners were killed and telephones broken, the question was, how will these British troops fight in the open after their first assault? How will our men stand between the first line and the second? As far as the German troops were concerned, there were no signs of cowardice, or low morale as we called it more kindly, in those early days of the struggle. They fought with a desperate courage, holding on to positions in rearguard actions when our guns were slashing them and when our men were getting near to them, making us pay a heavy price for every little copse or gully or section of trench and above all serving their machine guns at La Boisselle, Overlars, above Fricourt, round Contalmaison, and at all points of their gradual retreat, with a wonderful obstinacy, until they were killed or captured. But fresh waves of British soldiers followed those who were checked or broken. After the first week of battle, the German General Staff had learned the truth about the qualities of those British new armies which had been mocked and caricatured in German comic papers. They learned that these amateur soldiers had the qualities of the finest troops in the world, not only extreme valor, but skill and cunning, not only a great power of endurance under the heaviest fire, but a spirit of attack which was terrible in its effect. They were fierce bayonet fighters. Once having gained a bit of earth or a ruined village, nothing would budge them unless they could be blasted out by gun fire. General Sixt von Arnim put down some candid notes in his report to Prince Ruprecht. The English infantry shows great dash in attack, a factor to which immense confidence in its overwhelming artillery greatly contributes. It has shown great tenacity in defense. This was especially noticeable in the case of small parties, which, when once established with machine guns in the corner of a wood or a group of houses, were very difficult to drive out. The German losses were piling up. The agony of the German troops under our shell fire was reaching unnatural limits of torture. The early prisoners I saw, Prussians and Bavarians of the 14th Reserve Corps, were nerve-broken, and told frightful stories of the way in which their regiments had been cut to pieces. The German generals had to fill up the gaps, to put new barriers of men against the waves of British infantry. They flung new troops into the line, called up hurriedly from reserve depots. Now, for the first time, their staff work showed signs of disorder and demoralization. When the Prussian Guards reserves were brought up from Valenciennes to counter-attack at Contalmaison, they were sent onto the battlefield without maps or local guides, and walked straight into our barrage. A whole battalion was cut to pieces, and many others suffered frightful things. Some of the prisoners told me that they had lost 3/4 of their number in casualties, and our troops advanced over heaps of killed and wounded. The 122d Bavarian Regiment in Contalmaison was among those which suffered horribly. Owing to our ceaseless gunfire, they could get no food supplies and no water. The dugouts were crowded, so that they had to take turns to get into these shelters, and outside our shells were bursting over every yard of ground. Those who went outside, a prisoner told me, were killed or wounded. Some of them had their heads blown off, and some of them their arms. But we went on taking turns in the hole, although those who went outside knew that it was their turn to die, most likely. At last, most of those who came into the hole were wounded, some of them badly, so that we lay in blood. That is one little picture in a great panorama of bloodshed. The German command was not thinking much about the human suffering of its troops. It was thinking of the next defensive line upon which they would have to fall back, if the pressure of the British offensive could be maintained, the Longueval-Bazentin-Pozières line. It was getting nervous. Owing to the enormous efforts made in the Verdun offensive, the supplies of ammunition were not adequate to the enormous demand. The German gunners were trying to compete with the British in continuity of bombardments, and the shells were running short. Guns were wearing out under this incessant strain, and it was difficult to replace them. General von Gallwitz received reports of an alarmingly large number of bursts in the bore, particularly in field guns. General von Arnim complained that reserve supplies of ammunition were only available in very small quantities. The German telephone system proved totally inadequate in consequence of the development which the fighting took. The German air service was surprisingly weak, and the British airmen had established temporary mastery. The numerical superiority of the enemy's airmen, noted General von Arnim, and the fact that their machines were better made, became disagreeably apparent to us, particularly in their direction of the enemy's artillery fire and in bomb dropping. On July 15th, the British troops broke the German second line at Longueval and the Bazentins, and inflicted great losses upon the enemy, who fought with their usual courage until the British bayonets were among them. A day or two later, the fortress of Overlars fell, and the remnants of the garrison, 150 strong, after a desperate and gallant resistance in ditches and tunnels, where they had fought to the last, surrendered with honor. Then began the long battle of the woods. Devil's Wood, High Wood, Trones Wood continued through August with most fierce and bloody fighting, which ended in our favor and forced the enemy back, gradually but steadily, in spite of the terrific bombardments which filled those woods with shell fire and the constant counter-attacks delivered by the Germans. Counter-attack. Came the order from the German staff, and battalions of men marched out obediently to certain death, sometimes with incredible folly on the part of their commanding officers, who ordered these attacks to be made without the slightest chance of success. I saw an example of that at close range during a battle at Falfamont Farm, near Guillemont. Our men had advanced from Wedgwood, and I watched them from a trench just south of this, to which I had gone at a great pace over shell craters and broken wire, with a young observing officer who had been detailed to report back to the guns. Old Falstaff, whose songs and stories had filled the tent under the Red Cross with laughter, toiled after us gallantly, but grunting and sweating under the sun like his prototype, until we lost him in our hurry. Presently a body of Germans came out of a copse called Lewes Wood, on rising ground, faced round among the thin, slashed trees of Falfamont, and advanced toward our men, shoulder to shoulder, like a solid bar. It was sheer suicide. I saw our men get their machine guns into action, and the right side of the living bar frittered away, and then the whole line fell into the scorched grass. Another line followed. They were tall men, and did not falter as they came forward, but it seemed to me they walked like men conscious of going to death. They died. The simile is outworn, but it was exactly as though some invisible scythe had mown them down. In all the letters written during those weeks of fighting and captured by us, from dead or living men, there was one cry of agony and horror. "I stood on the brink of the most terrible days of my life," wrote one of them. They were those of the Battle of the Somme. It began with a night attack on August 13th and 14th. The attack lasted till the evening of the 18th, when the English wrote on our bodies in letters of blood, "It is all over with you." A handful of half-mad, wretched creatures, worn out in body and mind, were all that was left of a whole battalion. We were that handful. The losses of many of the German battalions were staggering, yet not greater than our own, and by the middle of August the morale of the troops was severely shaken. The 117th Division, by Pozires, suffered very heavily. The 11th Reserve and 157th Regiments each lost nearly 3/4 of their effectives. The 9th Reserve Corps had also lost heavily. The 9th Reserve Jaeger Battalion lost about 3/4, the 84th Reserve and 86th Reserve over half. On August 10th, the 16th Division had 6 battalions in reserve. By August 19th, owing to the large number of casualties, the greater part of those reserves had been absorbed into the front and support trenches, leaving as available reserves 2 exhausted battalions. The weakness of the division and the absolute necessity of reinforcing it led to the 15th Reserve Infantry Regiment, 2D Guards Division, being brought up to strengthen the right flank in the Leipzig salient. This regiment had suffered casualties to the extent of over 50% west of Pozires during the middle of July, and showed no eagerness to return to the fight. These are but a few examples of what was happening along the whole of the German front on the Somme. It became apparent by the end of August that the enemy was in trouble to find fresh troops to relieve his exhausted divisions, and that the wastage was faster than the arrival of new men. It was noticeable that he left divisions in the line until incapable of further effort, rather than relieving them earlier, so that after resting they might again be brought onto the battlefield. The only conclusion to be drawn from this was that the enemy had not sufficient formations available to make the necessary reliefs. In July, 3 of these exhausted divisions were sent to the east, their place being taken by 2 new divisions, and in August 3 more exhausted divisions were sent to Russia, 8 new divisions coming to the Somme front. The British and French offensive was drawing in all the German reserves and draining them of their life's blood. "We entrained at Savigny," wrote a man of one of these regiments, and at once knew our destination. It was our old bloodbath, the Somme. In many letters this phrase was used. The Somme was called the Bath of Blood by the German troops, who waded across its shell craters and in the ditches which were heaped with their dead. But what I have described is only the beginning of the battle, and the bath was to be filled deeper in the months that followed. Part 6, Chapter 21. The name, that blood bath, and the news of battle could not be hidden from the people of Germany, who had already been chilled with horror by the losses of Verdun, nor from the soldiers of reserve regiments quartered in French and Belgian towns like Valenciennes, Saint-Quentin, Cambrai, Lille, Bruges, and as far back as Brussels, waiting to go to the front, nor from the civil population of those towns. Held for 2 years by their enemy, these blonde young men who lived in their houses, marched down their streets, and made love to their women. The news was brought down from the Somme front by Red Cross trains, arriving in endless succession and packed with maimed and mangled men. German military policemen formed cordons round the railway stations, pushed back civilians who came to stare with somber eyes at these blanketed bundles of living flesh. But when the ambulances rumbled through the streets toward the hospitals, long processions of them, with the soles of men's boots turned up over the stretchers on which they lay quiet, and stiff the tale was told, though no word was spoken. The tale of defeat, of great losses, of grave and increasing anxiety, was told clearly enough as I read in captured letters by the faces of German officers who went about in these towns behind the lines with gloomy looks, and whose tempers, never of the sweetest, became irritable and unbearable, so that the soldiers hated them for all this cursing and bullying. A certain battalion commander had a nervous breakdown because he had to meet his colonel in the morning. "He is dying with fear and anxiety," wrote one of his comrades. Other men, not battalion commanders, were even more afraid of their superior officers, upon whom this bad news from the Somme had an evil effect. The bad news was spread by divisions taken out of the line and sent back to rest. The men reported that their battalions had been cut to pieces. Some of their regiments had lost 3/4 of their strength. They described the frightful effect of the British artillery, the smashed trenches, the shell crater, the horror. It was not good for the morale of men who were just going up there to take their turn. The man who was afraid of his colonel sits all day long writing home, with the picture of his wife and children before his eyes. He was afraid of other things. Bavarian soldiers quarreled with Prussians, accused them, unjustly, of shirking the summer battlefields and leaving the Bavarians to go to the bloodbath. All the Bavarian troops are being sent to the Somme. This much is certain: you can see no Prussians there, and this in spite of the losses the 1st Bavarian Corps suffered recently at Verdun. And how we did suffer, it appears that we are in for another turn, at least the 5th Bavarian Division. Everybody has been talking about it for a long time. To the devil with it. Every Bavarian regiment is being sent into it, and it's a swindle. It was in no cheerful mood that men went away to the Somme battlefields. Those battalions of grey-clad men entrained without any of the old enthusiasm with which they had gone to earlier battles. Their gloom was noticed by the officers. "Sing, you sheep's heads, sing," they shouted. They were compelled to sing by order. "In the afternoon," wrote a man of the 18th Reserve Division, "we had to go out again. We were to learn to sing. The greater part did not join in, and the song went feebly. Then we had to march round in a circle and sing, and that went no better. After that we had an hour off, and on the way back to billets we were to sing Deutschland über alles, but this broke down completely. One never hears songs of the fatherland anymore." They were silent, grave-eyed men who marched through the streets of French and Belgian towns to be entrained for the Somme front, for they had forebodings of the fate before them. Yet none of their forebodings were equal in intensity of fear to the frightful reality into which they were flung. The journey to the Somme front on the German side was a way of terror, ugliness, and death. Not all the imagination of morbid minds searching obscenely for foulness and blood in the great, deep pits of human agony could surpass these scenes along the way to the German lines round Courcelette and Flers, Gueudecourt, Morval, and Les Bouffes. Many times, long before a German battalion had arrived near the trenches, it was but a collection of nerve-broken men bemoaning losses already suffered far behind the lines and filled with hideous apprehension. For British long-range guns were hurling high explosives into distant villages, burraging crossroads, reaching out to railheads and ammunition dumps, while British airmen were on bombing flights over railway stations and rest billets and high roads down which the German troops came marching at Cambrai, Bapaume in the valley between Arles and Warlencourt, at Ligny-Thilloy, Busigny, and many other places on the lines of route. German soldiers arriving one morning at Cambrai by train found themselves under the fire of a single aeroplane which flew very low and dropped bombs. They exploded with heavy crashes, and one bomb hit the first carriage behind the engine, killing and wounding several men. A second bomb hit the station buildings, and there was a clatter of broken glass, the rending of wood, and the fall of bricks. All lights went out, and the German soldiers groped about in the darkness, amid the splinters of glass and the fallen bricks, searching for the wounded by the sound of their groans. It was but one scene along the way to that bloodbath through which they had to wade to the trenches of the Somme. Flights of British airplanes circled over the villages on the way. At Grevillers, in August, 11112, 16 bombs fell in the market square, so that the center of the village collapsed in a state of ruin, burying soldiers billeted there. Every day the British airmen paid these visits, meeting the Germans far up the roads on their way to the Somme, and swooping over them like a flying death. Even on the march in open country, the German soldiers tramping silently along, not singing in spite of orders, were bombed and shot at by these British aviators, who flew down very low, pouring out streams of machine gun bullets. The Germans lost their nerve at such times and scattered into the ditches, falling over one another, struck and cursed by their Unteroffizieren, and leaving their dead and wounded in the roadway. As the roads went nearer to the battlefields, they were choked with the traffic of war, with artillery and transport wagons and horse ambulances, and always thousands of grey men marching up to the lines or back from them, exhausted and broken after many days in the fires of hell up there. Officers sat on their horses by the roadside, directing all the traffic with the usual swearing and cursing, and rode alongside the transport wagons and the troops, urging them forward at a quicker pace because of stern orders received from headquarters demanding quicker movement. The reserves, it seemed, were desperately wanted up in the lines. The English were attacking again. God alone knew what was happening. Regiments had lost their way. Wounded were pouring back. Officers had gone mad. Into the midst of all this turmoil, shells fell, shells from long-range guns. Transport wagons were blown to bits. The bodies and fragments of artillery horses lay all over the roads. Men lay dead or bleeding under the debris of gun wheels and broken bricks. Above all the noise of this confusion and death in the night, the hard, stern voices of German officers rang out, and German discipline prevailed, and men marched on to greater perils. They were in the shell zone now, and sometimes a regiment on the march was tracked all along the way by British gun fire directed from airplanes and captive balloons. It was the fate of a captured officer I met who had detrained at Bapaume for the trenches at Contalmaison. At Bapaume his battalion was hit by fragments of 12-inch shells. Nearer to the line they came under the fire of 8-inch and 6-inch shells. 4.7s, 4.7s, found them somewhere by Bazentin. At Contalmaison they marched into a barrage, and here the officer was taken prisoner. Of his battalion there were few men left. It was so with the 3D Jaeger battalion, ordered up hurriedly to make a counter-attack near Flers. They suffered so heavily on the way to the trenches that no attack could be made. The stretcher-bearers had all the work to do. The way up to the trenches became more tragic as every kilometre was passed, until the stench of corruption was wafted on the wind, so that men were sickened and tried not to breathe, and marched hurriedly to get on the lee side of its foulness. They walked now through places which had once been villages, but were sinister ruins where death lay in wait for German soldiers. "It seems queer to me," wrote one of them, "that whole villages close to the front look as flattened as a child's toy run over by a steam roller. Not one stone remains on another. The streets are one line of shell holes. Add to that the thunder of the guns, and you will see with what feelings we come into the line, into trenches where for months shells of all caliber have rained. Flers is a scrap heap." Again and again men lost their way up to the lines. The reliefs could only be made at night, lest they should be discovered by British airmen and British gunners, and even if these German soldiers had trench maps, the guidance was but little good when many trenches had been smashed in and only shell craters could be found. In the front line of Flers, wrote one of these Germans, the men were only occupying shell holes. Behind there was the intense smell of putrefaction which filled the trench almost unbearably. The corpses lie either quite insufficiently covered with earth on the edge of the trench, or quite close under the bottom of the trench, so that the earth lets the stench through. In some places bodies lie quite uncovered in a trench recess, and no one seems to trouble about them. One sees horrible pictures, here an arm, here a foot, here a head sticking out of the earth. And these are all German soldiers' heroes. Not far from us, at the entrance to a dugout, 9 men were buried, of whom 3 were dead. All along the trench men kept on getting buried. What had been a perfect trench a few hours before was in parts completely blown in. The men are getting weaker. It is impossible to hold out any longer. Losses can no longer be reckoned accurately. Without a doubt many of our people are killed. That is only one out of thousands of such gruesome pictures. True as the death they described, true to the pictures on our side of the line as on their side, which went back to German homes during the battles of the Somme. Those German soldiers were great letter writers, and men sitting in wet ditches, in foxholes, as they called their dugouts, up to my waist in mud, as one of them described, scribbled pitiful things which they hoped might reach their people at home as a voice from the dead. For they had had little hope of escape from the bloodbath. "When you get this, I shall be a corpse," wrote one of them, and one finds the same foreboding in many of these documents. Even the lucky ones who could get some cover from the incessant bombardment by English guns began to lose their nerves after a day or two. They were always in fear of British infantry sweeping upon them, suddenly behind the Trommelfeuer, rushing their dugouts with bombs and bayonets. Sentries became jumpy and signalled attacks when there were no attacks. The gas alarm was sounded constantly by the clang of a bell in the trench, and men put on their heavy gas masks and sat in them until they were nearly stifled. Here is a little picture of life in a German dugout near the British lines, written by a man now dead. The telephone bell rings. "Are you there?" "Yes, here's Now's battalion." "Good, that is all." Then that ceases, and now the wire is in again, perhaps for the 25th or 30th time. Thus the night is interrupted, and now they come, alarm messages, one after the other, each more terrifying than the other, of enormous losses through the bombs and shells of the enemy, of huge masses of troops advancing upon us, of all possible possibilities, such as a train broken down, and we are tortured by all the terrors that the mind can invent. Our nerves quiver. We clench our teeth. None of us can forget the horrors of the night. Heavy rain fell and the dugouts became wet and filthy. Our sleeping places were full of water. We had to try and bail out the trenches with cooking dishes. I lay down in the water with G. We were to have worked on dugouts, but not a soul could do any more. Only a few sections got coffee. Mine got nothing at all. I was frozen in every limb, poured the water out of my boots, and lay down again. Our men suffered exactly the same things, but did not write about them. The German generals and their staffs could not be quite indifferent to all this welter of human suffering among their troops, in spite of the cold, scientific spirit with which they regarded the problem of war. The agony of the individual soldier would not trouble them. There is no war without agony. But the psychology of masses of men had to be considered, because it affects the efficiency of the machine. The German General Staff on the Western Front was becoming seriously alarmed by the declining morale of its infantry under the increasing strain of the British attacks, and adopted stern measures to cure it. But it could not hope to cure the heaps of German dead who were lying on the battlefields, nor the maimed men who were being carried back to the dressing stations, nor to bring back the prisoners taken in droves by the French and British troops. Before the attack on the Flers line, the capture of Thiepval, and the German debacle at Beaumont Hamel, in November, the enemy's command was already filled with a grave anxiety at the enormous losses of its fighting strength, was compelled to adopt new expedients for increasing the number of its divisions. It was forced to withdraw troops badly needed on other fronts, and the successive shocks of the British offensive reached as far as Germany itself, so that the whole of its recruiting system had to be revised to fill up the gaps torn out of the German ranks. Part 6, Chapter 22. All through July and August the enemy's troops fought with wonderful and stubborn courage, defending every bit of broken woodland, every heap of bricks that was once a village, every line of trenches smashed by heavy shell fire, with obstinacy. It is indeed fair and just to say that throughout those battles of the Somme our men fought against an enemy hard to beat, grim and resolute, and inspired sometimes with the courage of despair, which was hardly less dangerous than the courage of hope. The Australians who struggled to get the high ground at Pozières did not have an easy task. The enemy made many counterattacks against them. All the ground thereabouts was, as I have said, so smashed that the earth became finely powdered, and it was the arena of bloody fighting at close quarters which did not last a day or two, but many weeks. Mouquet Farm was like the phoenix which rose again out of its ashes. In its tunneled ways German soldiers hid, and came out to fight our men in the rear long after the site of the farm was in our hands. But the German troops were fighting what they knew to be a losing battle. They were fighting rear-guard actions, trying to gain time for the hasty digging of ditches behind them, trying to sell their lives at the highest price. They lived not only under incessant gunfire, gradually weakening their nerve power, working a physical as well as a moral change in them, but in constant terror British attacks. They could never be sure of safety at any hour of the day or night, even in their deepest dugouts. The British varied their times of attack. At dawn, at noon, when the sun was reddening in the west, just before the dusk in pitch darkness, even the steady, regular bombardment that had never ceased all through the days and nights would concentrate into the great tumult of sudden drum fire, and presently waves of men English or Scottish or Irish, Australians or Canadians would be sweeping onto them and over them, rummaging down into the dugouts with bombs and bayonets, gathering up prisoners, quick to kill if men were not quick to surrender. In this way Thiepval was encircled, so that the garrison there, the 180th Regiment, who had held it for 2 years, knew that they were doomed. In this way Guillemont and Ginchy fell, so that in the first place hardly a man out of 2,000 men escaped to tell the tale of horror in German lines, and in the second place there was no long fight against the Irish, who stormed it in a wild, fierce rush which even machine guns could not check. The German General Staff was getting flurried, grabbing at battalions from other parts of the line, disorganizing its divisions under the urgent need of flinging in men to stop this rot in the lines, ordering counter-attacks which were without any chance of success, so that thin waves of men came out into the open, as I saw them several times, to be swept down by scythes of bullets which cut them clean to the earth. Before September 15th they hoped that the British offensive was wearing itself out. It seemed to them at least doubtful that after the struggle of 2.5 months, the British troops could still have spirit and strength enough to fling themselves against new lines. But the machinery of their defense was crumbling. Many of their guns had worn out and could not be replaced quickly enough. Many batteries had been knocked out in their emplacements along the line of Bazentin and Longueval before the artillery was drawn back to Grand Court and a new line of safety. Battalion commanders clamored for greater supplies of hand grenades, entrenching tools, trench mortars, signal rockets, and all kinds of fighting material, enormously in excess of all previous requirements. The difficulties of dealing with the wounded, who littered the battlefields and choked the roads with the traffic of ambulances, became increasingly severe, owing to the dearth of horses for transport and the longer range of British guns which had been brought far forward. The German General Staff studied its next lines of defense away through Courcelette, Martinpuich, Lesboeufs, Morval, and Cumbles, and they did not look too good, but with luck and the courage of German soldiers, and the exhaustion, surely those fellows were exhausted, of British troops good enough. On September 15th the German command had another shock when the whole line of the British troops on the Somme front south of the Ancre rose out of their trenches and swept over the German defences in a tide. Those defences broke hopelessly, and the waves dashed through, here and there, as on the German left at Morval and Lesboeufs, the bulwarks stood for a time, but the British pressed against them and round them. On the German right, below the little river of the Ancre, Courcelette fell, and Martinpuich, and at last, as I have written, High Wood, which the Germans desired to hold at all costs, and had held against incessant attacks by great concentration of artillery, was captured and left behind by the London men. A new engine of war had come as a demoralizing influence among German troops, spreading terror among them on the first day out of the tanks. For the first time the Germans were outwitted in inventions of destruction, they who had been foremost in all engines of death. It was the moment of real panic in the German lines, a panic reaching back from the troops to the high command. 10 days later, on September 25th, when the British made a new advance, all this time the French were pressing forward, too. On our right by Roy Combles was evacuated without a fight and with a litter of dead in its streets. Gueudecourt, Lesboeufs, and Morval were lost by the Germans, and a day later Thiepval, the greatest fortress position next to Beaumont-Hamel, fell, with all its garrison taken prisoners. They were black days in the German headquarters, where staff officers heard the news over their telephones and sent stern orders to artillery commanders and divisional generals, and after dictating new instructions that certain trench systems must be held at whatever price, heard that already they were lost. It was at this time that the morale of the German troops on the Somme front showed most signs of breaking. In spite of all their courage, the ordeal had been too hideous for them, and in spite of all their discipline, the iron discipline of the German soldier, they were on the edge of revolt. The intimate and undoubted facts of this break in the morale of the enemy's troops during this period reveal a pitiful picture of human agony. "We are now fighting on the Somme with the English," wrote a man of the 17th Bavarian Regiment. "You can no longer call it war. It is mere murder. We are at the focal point of the present battle in Furrow Wood, near Guillemont. All my previous experiences in this war, the slaughter at Ypres and the battle in the gravel pit at Hulluch, are the purest child's play compared with this massacre, and that is much too mild a description. I hardly think they will bring us into the fight again, for we are in a very bad way." From September 12th to 27th we were on the Somme, wrote a man of the 10th Bavarians, and my regiment had 1,500 casualties. A detailed picture of the German losses under our bombardment was given in the diary of an officer captured in a trench near Fleurs and dated September 22d. The 4 days ending September 4th, spent in the trenches, were characterized by a continual enemy bombardment that did not abate for a single instant. The enemy had registered on our trenches with light, as well as medium and heavy, batteries, notwithstanding that he had no direct observation from his trenches, which lie on the other side of the summit. His registering was done by his excellent air service, which renders perfect reports of everything observed. During the first day, for instance, whenever the slightest movement was visible in our trenches during the presence, as is usually the case, of enemy aircraft flying as low as 300 and 400 yards, a heavy bombardment of the particular section took place. The very heavy losses during the first day brought about the resolution to evacuate the trenches during the daytime. Only a small garrison was left, the remainder withdrawing to a part of the line on the left of the Martinpuich-Pozières road. The signal for a bombardment by heavies was given by the English airplanes. On the first day we tried to fire by platoons on the airplanes, but a second airplane retaliated by dropping bombs and firing his machine gun at our troops. Our own airmen appeared only once for a short time behind our lines. While many airplanes are observing from early morning till late at night, our own hardly ever venture near. The opinion is that our trenches cannot protect troops during a barrage of the shortest duration, owing to lack of dugouts. The enemy understands how to prevent, with his terrible barrage, the bringing up of building material, and even how to hinder the work itself. The consequence is that our trenches are always ready for an assault on his part. Our artillery, which does occasionally put a heavy barrage on the enemy trenches at a great expense of ammunition, cannot cause similar destruction to him. He can bring his building material up, can repair his trenches as well as build new ones, can bring up rations and ammunition, and remove the wounded. The continual barrage on our lines of communication makes it very difficult for us to ration and relieve our troops, to supply water, ammunition and building material, to evacuate wounded, and causes heavy losses. This, and the lack of protection from artillery fire, and the weather, the lack of hot meals, the continual necessity of lying still in the same place, the danger of being buried, the long time the wounded have to remain in the trenches, and chiefly the terrible effect of the machine and heavy artillery fire, controlled by an excellent air service, has a most demoralizing effect on the troops. Only with the greatest difficulty could the men be persuaded to stay in the trenches under those conditions. There were some who could not be persuaded to stay if they could see any chance of deserting or malingering. For the first time on our front, the German officers could not trust the courage of their men, nor their loyalty, nor their sense of discipline. All this horror of men blown to bits over living men, of trenches heaped with dead and dying, was stronger than courage, stronger than loyalty, stronger than discipline. A moral rot was threatening to bring the German troops on the Somme front to disaster. Large numbers of men reported sick and tried by every kind of trick to be sent back to base hospitals. In the 4th Bavarian Division desertions were frequent, and several times whole bodies of men refused to go forward into the front line. The morale of men in the 393d Regiment, taken at Courcelette, seemed to be very weak. One of the prisoners declared that they gave themselves up without firing a shot, because they could trust the English not to kill them. The platoon commander had gone away, and the prisoner was ordered to alarm the platoon in case of attack, but did not do so on purpose. They did not shoot with rifles or machine guns, and did not throw bombs. Many of the German officers were as demoralized as the men, shirking their posts in the trenches, shamming sickness, and even leading the way to surrender. Prisoners of the 351st Regiment, which lost 1,300 men in 15 days, told of officers who had refused to take their men up to the front line, and of whole companies who had declined to move when ordered to do so. An officer of the 74th Landwehr Regiment is said by prisoners to have told his men during our preliminary bombardment to surrender as soon as we attacked. A German regimental order says, "I must state with the greatest regret that the regiment, during this change of position, had to take notice of the sad fact that men of 4 of the companies, inspired by shameful cowardice, left their companies on their own initiative and did not move into line." Another order contains the same fact and a warning of what punishment may be meted out. Proofs are multiplying of men leaving the position without permission and hiding at the rear. It is our duty, each at his post, to deal with this fact with energy and success. Many Bavarians complained that their officers did not accompany them into the trenches, but went down to the hospitals with imaginary diseases. In any case, there was a great deal of real sickness, mental and physical. The ranks were depleted by men suffering from fever, pleurisy, jaundice, and stomach complaints of all kinds, twisted up with rheumatism after lying in waterlogged holes, lamed for life by bad cases of trench foot, and nerve broken so that they could do nothing but weep. The nervous cases were the worst and in greatest number. Many men went raving mad. The shell shock victims clawed at their mouths unceasingly, or lay motionless like corpses with staring eyes, or trembled in every limb, moaning miserably and afflicted with a great terror. To the Germans, barely less to British troops, the Somme battlefields were not only shambles, but a territory which the devil claimed as his own for the torture of men's brains and souls before they died in the furnace fires. A spirit of revolt against all this crept into the minds of men who retained their sanity, a revolt against the people who had ordained this vast outrage, against God and humanity. Into German letters there crept bitter, burning words against the millionaires who grow rich out of the war, against the high people who live in comfort behind the lines. Letters from home inflamed these thoughts. It was not good reading for men under shell fire. It seems that you soldiers fight so that official stay-at-homes can treat us as female criminals. Tell me, dear husband, are you a criminal when you fight in the trenches, or why do people treat women and children here as such? For the poor here it is terrible, and yet the rich, the gilded ones, the bloated aristocrats, gobble up everything in front of our very eyes. All soldiers, friend and foe, ought to throw down their weapons and go on strike, so that this war which enslaves the people more than ever may cease. Thousands of letters, all in this strain, were reaching the German soldiers on the Somme, and they did not strengthen the morale of men already victims of terror and despair. Behind the lines, deserters were shot in batches. To those in front came orders of the day warning them, exhorting them, commanding them to hold fast. To the hesitating and faint-hearted in the regiment, says one of these orders, I would say the following: what the Englishman can do, the German can do also. Or if, on the other hand, the Englishman really is a better and superior being, he would be quite justified in his aim as regards this war, viz., the extermination of the German. There is a further point to be noted. This is the first time we have been in the line on the Somme, and what is more, we are there at a time when things are more calm. The English regiments opposing us have been in the firing line for the second, and in some cases even the third time. Heads up and play the man. It was easy to write such documents. It was more difficult to bring up reserves of men and ammunition. The German command was harder pressed by the end of September. From July 1st to September 8th, according to trustworthy information, 53 German divisions, in all, were engaged against the Allies on the summer battlefront. Out of these, 14 were still in the line on September 8th. 28 had been withdrawn, broken and exhausted, to quieter areas. 11 more had been withdrawn to rest billets. Under the Allies' artillery fire and infantry attacks, the average life of a German division as a unit fit for service on the Somme was 19 days. More than 2 new German divisions had to be brought into the front line every week since the end of June to replace those smashed in the process of resisting the Allied attack. In November, it was reckoned by competent observers in the field that well over 120 German divisions had been passed through the ordeal of the Somme, this number including those which have appeared there more than once. Part 6, Chapter 23. By September 25th, when the British troops made another attack, the morale of the German troops was reaching its lowest ebb. Except on their right, at Beaumont-Hamel and Beaucourt, they were far beyond the great system of protective dugouts which had given them a sense of safety before July 1st. Their second and third lines of defense had been carried, and they were existing in shell craters and trenches hastily scraped up under ceaseless artillery fire. The horrors of the battlefield were piled up to heights of agony and terror. Living men dwelt among the unburied dead, made their way to the front lines over heaps of corpses, breathed in the smell of human corruption, and had always in their ears the cries of the wounded they could not rescue. They wrote these things in tragic letters, thousands of them, which never reached their homes in Germany, but lay in their captured ditches. The number of dead lying about is awful. One stumbles over them. The stench of the dead lying round us is unbearable. We are no longer men here. We are worse than beasts. It is hell let loose. It is horrible. we've lived in misery. If the dear ones at home could see all this, perhaps there would be a change, but they are never told. The ceaseless roar of the guns is driving us mad. Poor, pitiful letters, out of their cries of agony one gets to the real truth of war, the glory and the splendor of it, preached by the German philosophers and British jingoes, who upheld it as the great strengthening tonic for their race and as the noblest experience of men. Every line these German soldiers wrote might have been written by one of ours. From both sides of the shifting lines there was the same death and the same hell. Behind the lines, the German General Staff, counting up the losses of battalions and divisions, who staggered out weakly, performed juggling tricks with what reserves it could lay its hands on, and flung up stray units to relieve the poor wretches in the trenches. Many of those reliefs lost their way in going up, and came up late, already shattered by the shell fire through which they passed. Our position, wrote a German infantry officer, was of course quite different from what we had been told. Our company alone relieved a whole battalion. We had been told we were to relieve a company of 50 men weakened by casualties. The men we relieved had no idea where the enemy was, how far off he was, or whether any of our own troops were in front of us. We got no idea of our support position until 6 o'clock this evening. The English are 400 yards away, by the windmill over the hill. One German soldier wrote that the British seemed to relieve their infantry very quickly, while the German commands work on the principle of relieving only in the direst need and leaving the divisions in as long as possible. Another wrote that the leadership of the divisions really fell through. For the most part we did not get orders, and the regiment had to manage as best it could. If orders arrived, they generally came too late or were dealt out from the green table without knowledge of the conditions in front, so that to carry them out was impossible. All this was a sign of demoralization, not only among the troops who were doing the fighting and the suffering, but among the organizing generals behind, who were directing the operations. The continual hammer strokes of the British and French armies on the Somme battlefield strained the German war machine on the Western Front almost to breaking point. It seemed as though a real debacle might happen, and that they would be forced to effect a general retreat, a withdrawal more or less at ease, or a retirement under pressure from the enemy. But they had luck, astonishing luck. At the very time when the morale of the German soldiers was lowest, and when the strain on the high command was greatest, the weather turned in their favor and gave them just the breathing space they desperately needed. Rain fell heavily in the middle of October, autumn mists prevented airplane activity and artillery work, and the ground became a quagmire, so that the British troops found it difficult to get up their supplies for a new advance. The Germans were able in this respite to bring up new divisions, fresh and strong enough to make heavy counterattacks in the Stuff and Schwaben and Regina trenches, and to hold the lines more securely for a time, while great digging was done farther back at Bapaume and the next line of defense. Successive weeks of bad weather and our own tragic losses checked the impetus of the British and French driving power, and the Germans were able to reorganize and reform. As I have said, the shock of our offensive reached as far as Germany and caused a complete reorganization in the system of obtaining reserves of manpower. The process of combing out, as we call it, was pursued with astounding ruthlessness, and German mothers, already stricken with the loss of their elder sons, raised cries of despair when the youngest born were also seized boys of 18, belonging to the 1918 class. The whole of the 1917 class had joined the depots in March and May of this year, receiving a 3 months training before being transferred to the field recruit depots in June and July. About the middle of July, the first large drafts joined their units and made their appearance at the front, and soon after the beginning of our offensive at least half this class was in the front-line regiments. The massacre of the boys had begun. Then older men beyond middle age, who correspond to the French territorial class, exempted from fighting service and kept on lines of communication, were also called to the front, and whole garrisons of these grey heads were removed from German towns to fill up the ranks. The view is held here, wrote a German soldier of the Somme, that the higher command intends gradually to have more and more Landsturm battalions, men of the oldest reserves, trained in trench warfare for a few weeks, as we have been, according to the quality of the men, and thus to secure by degrees a body of troops on which it can count in an emergency. In the month of November, the German High Command believed that the British attacks were definitely at an end, having broken down, as they claimed, in mud and blood. But another shock came to them when once more British troops, the 51st Highland Division, and the 63d Naval Division left their trenches in fog and snow and captured the strongest fortress position on the enemy's front at Beaumont Hamel, bringing back over 6,000 prisoners. It was after that they began their retreat. These studies of mine, of what happened on both sides of the shifting lines in the Somme, must be as horrible to read as they were to write. But they are less than the actual truth, for no pen will ever in one book, or in hundreds, give the full record of the individual agony, the broken heart springs, the soul shock as well as the shell shock, of that frightful struggle in which, on one side and the other, 2 million men were engulfed. Modern civilization was wrecked on those fire-blasted fields, though they led to what we called victory. More died there than the flower of our youth and German manhood. The old order of the world died there, because many men who came alive out of that conflict were changed, and vowed not to tolerate a system of thought which had led up to such a monstrous massacre of human beings who prayed to the same God, loved the same joys of life, and had no hatred of one another except as it had been lighted and inflamed by their governors, their philosophers, and their newspapers. The German soldier cursed the militarism which had plunged him into that horror. The British soldier cursed the German as the direct cause of all his trouble, but looked back on his side of the lines and saw an evil there, which was also his enemy, the evil of a secret diplomacy, which juggled with the lives of humble men so that war might be sprung upon them without their knowledge or consent, and the evil of rulers who hated German militarism not because of its wickedness, but because of its strength in rivalry, and the evil of a folly in the minds of men which had taught them to regard war as a glorious adventure, and patriotism as the right to dominate other peoples, and liberty as a catchword of politicians in search of power. After the Somme battles there were many other battles as bloody and terrible, but they only confirmed greater numbers of men in the faith that the old world had been wrong in its make-up and wrong in its religion of life. Lip service to Christian ethics was not good enough as an argument for this. Either the heart of the world must be changed by a real obedience to the gospel of Christ, or Christianity must be abandoned for a new creed which would give better results between men and nations. There could be no reconciling of bayonet drill and high explosives with the words "love one another." Or if bayonet drill and high explosive force were to be the rule of life in preparation for another struggle such as this, then at least let men put hypocrisy away and return to the primitive law of the survival of the fittest in a jungle world subservient to the king of beasts. The devotion of military chaplains to the wounded, their valor, their decorations for gallantry under fire, their human comradeship and spiritual sincerity would not bridge the gulf in the minds of many soldiers between a gospel of love and this argument by bayonet and bomb, gas shell and high velocity, blunderbuss, club and trench shovel. Some time or other, when German militarism acknowledged defeat by the break of its machine or by the revolt of its people, not until then, there must be a new order of things which would prevent such another massacre in the fair fields of life, and that could come only by a faith in the hearts of many peoples, breaking down old barriers of hatred and reaching out to one another in a fellowship of common sense based on common interests and inspired by an ideal higher than this beast-like rivalry of nations. So thinking men thought and talked. So said the soldier poets who wrote from the trenches. So said many onlookers. The simple soldier did not talk like that, unless he were a Frenchman. Our men only began to talk like that after the war, as many of them are now talking, and the revolt of the spirit, vague but passionate, against the evil that had produced this devil's trap of war. And the German challenge was subconscious as they sat in their dugouts and crowded in their ditches in the battles of the Somme.
This concludes the 15th part of 18 total of Now It Can Be Told by Philip Gibbs, produced by Best Audiobooks for free.